All right, good evening, and this is the third chapter within the Human Resource class here at University of Maryland, University College. My name is Kevin Matthews, and I'm the professor for this class. If you have any questions while we're having our discussion today, go ahead and leave them in the comment box below, or you can go ahead and email me directly, and I'll be happy to answer them as much as I can. Today we're going to talk, Chapter 3 is focusing around diversity and multiculturalism. I really normally when I do this class, I kind of start off where I talk a little bit about my background as just as a human being and how this topic is really kind of interwoven in my life as we go. And I've made no shame about the fact that in this class, compensation is one of my favorite topics, and of course it's an obvious reason why I'm a CPA, so that obviously kind of hits home, and it's also an area that I specialize in. So when we're talking a little bit about that, obviously there are various topics, but when I talk about topics that are just for fun, that are just have a personal interest for me, that has nothing that I intend on making money off of, nothing that I intend on selling for this, it's just really diversity and multiculturalism, and that's just because it's been interwoven in my life so much as I've grown up. When I started off, as a young kid, I lived on Air Force bases because I was an Air Force brat. My father, who was enlisted, he served in the United States Air Force. And for those of you who haven't served in the United States military, the enlisted corps, as opposed to the officer corps, one of the requirements to become an officer in the United States military is you have to go to college and get a 4-year degree. And so, typically what ends up happening is, you have people who go to college and then do that. So it definitely creates a different type of sort of mindset, I would say, than the enlisted person who graduates from high school and can go into the military, not really walk in. I mean, they have to apply and get accepted. And definitely if there's a service that has stringent standards on who they're going to bring in, it would definitely be the Air Force. And so my father, we used to move around to various military bases, and for me, it wasn't really a big deal about diversity at this time, and one of the reasons why was because, I was surrounded by diversity. The enlisted kids, because, all you had to do is graduate high school in order to go in, and you got a wide variety of America that would kind of show up, and then what they would end up doing is, they'd serve their country. And the military base that I stayed on when we were in New Mexico, it really kind of epitomized that. One of my best friends that was across the street from me, he had a father who was black and a mother who was Korean. 2 houses down from that was a kid who was from Latin America. Over here we had a Cuban family who had moved in. They didn't have any kids, but that was fine. We always liked to hang out with them anyways. They were always a lot of fun. And then there was another family where a gentleman had escaped from the then Soviet Union, and later on in life, I think he had escaped as a young child with his parents, and later on in his life, he decided he was going to join the service and do some service for his country. He was married and had, I can't remember if he had, I don't think he had any kids now that I think about it. But, so for me, diversity was never really an issue, growing up on bases like this. We never even talked about it. I mean, nobody ever made, comments about, people's race, people's culture, people's, ethnicity, creed, any of that stuff. Now, of course, this is when we were growing up, at the age of 8, and, there's probably some innocence that was kind of going on, but this topic really kind of hit me when we left the military and went to our first place where we were at, Los Angeles, California. We lived in a city called Lawndale, which was predominantly Latino and Filipino. And so many of my friends that I went to elementary school with at that time were, their parents were either from the Philippines. One of my very good friends, her family was Vietnamese. One of my, fellow classmates, he was from Germany, which was interesting in and of itself. And then, my teacher was Jewish, so, I really got to, sort of get a lot of diversity at this school too. But it seemed like they kind of treated differences differently than it was in the service. Like I said, predominantly Hispanic and Filipino, and it seemed like those two groups, they got along, but there was definitely divisions, and it was kind of my first time where I had seen those types of divisions. And at first I didn't really think too much of it until I'd seen where there was an altercation between one of my friends who was Filipino and another kid who was from Latin America. Actually, he had immigrated directly from Latin America, and they got into a huge fight, and there was some needless to say, some racial comments that were said back and forth. And so that was kind of my first experience with the importance of diversity. And of course, when you're at that young age, you don't really think big picture. But as I grew up, and my father ended up taking orders to Rapid City, South Dakota, where I went to a high school, and it got, diversity got really thrown to the other side, where out of a high school of about 400 students, only 3 were black. We had a handful who were Native American, because we're, South Dakota, there's a lot of Indian reservations, and so there's a lot of people who, they can live on the reservations if they want to, but many of them will come out and live in town. And in my junior high school, there were some students who were Native American. Had a handful of Asians, but I was looking at an old photo that I took from that time, and it just surprised me at the lack of diversity in that picture. I just, like I said, I wasn't really thinking big picture at that time. Teenagers, we don't think about big picture at any time like that. And then, later on, my father took orders again, and he ended up back in, or not back, but we ended up in Abilene, Texas. In Abilene, Texas, I went to school, Abilene High School, and at Abilene High School, there was, we used to have a saying, we said it kind of as a joke, but, there was some truth to it, which, they say is the root of all good humor, is that there's at least a shred of truth to it, where, we had the saying we said was that the majority was the minority. And, it was true. There was no one race that was really the majority. There was no one culture that was the majority. There was no creed or even religion, I would say. I mean, even though Abilene was predominantly a Christian town, there were some people of different religions, even though I think it wasn't as predominant as it was in other places that I had lived in. But again, I'd moved down there, and this was, the South. And racial lines were drawn, and really the only place where I saw that those racial lines tended to get crossed freely and frequently was in a class that I took a lot of heart in, and that was ROTC. And the reason why it didn't seem to bother anyone there was because most of us were all Air Force brats, or Army brats, or Navy brats, and we had moved to Abilene, and many of us had joined. Now, there were a lot of people who joined Air Force Junior ROTC that did not have a military background, or weren't Air Force brats or whatever, but many of them ended up joining the military later on. But it seemed like that was like the one area that I could go to where I felt most comfortable, and I never had kind of put that into perspective until I started doing a lot of reflection about diversity and multiculturalism in my own life. And then, of course, after that, I moved up to Spokane, Washington again. I would say predominantly white. That's when I went to college. And then after that, I ended up going to Japan and teaching English for a while. And that was where I kind of experienced a homogeneous society. In one sense, it was interesting because the culture was predominantly the same everywhere you went. I mean, Japanese culture is Japanese culture. I mean, there's minor differences depending on the location you're at, whether it's Osaka or Tokyo or whatever. But predominantly, Japanese people, tend to unite a lot. And, you know, for me to go there, I was, you know, kind of seen as the fascination, you know, what's he like, blah, blah, blah. And I spoke Japanese, so it actually turned out to be a pretty good experience for them and for me to kind of introduce who I was and try to break some of the stereotypes of the typical American. But there were other friends of mine who went there, and, you know, like one of my very good friends when I was there, he came from Nigeria, and you know, this was the first time that many of them had ever seen somebody from Africa, and so you know, that was a very interesting, fascinating thing to watch when you know, and he was very popular. I mean, that man he would smile all the time, and you know, he you know, made everyone kind of laugh, and so. You know, very quickly, he broke down a lot of stereotypical barriers that I think a lot of Japanese people had at that time towards people, you know, who are African descent. And so I was very happy to be a part of that, and that's one of the best parts I love about that program. And luckily, you know, the Japanese government still keeps up with it, and they still do it. In fact, if you get your bachelor's degree and want to go do something fun for your life, you know, I would recommend the JET program very quickly. It's a good way to take a couple years off and go enjoy yourself. I certainly did, and I had a great experience. Coming back to the United States, went back to college, 9/11 happened, and I joined the Navy, once again back in my diverse environment, where I felt, you know, again, more comfortable, which is kind of strange, because usually when we talk about multiculturalism and diversity, people don't normally feel comfortable in more diverse environments. But for me, it's weird. I just don't feel as comfortable about it. And then, you know, something that I've, you know, noticed as I've gotten a little bit older is how this really severely influenced me. I met my wife, who's, you know, a very lovely lady from, you know, who is a very lovely lady from China. And, you know, I got to see how people interacted with her. There were some people who treated her very well, and there were some people who treated her not so well. But it was kind of the first time that I had been able to see some of the negative reactions towards people who were just different, and it always bothered me. You know, so I've kind of committed myself to wanting to be able to do this topic, and so everywhere that I go, I try to find ways to encourage diversity and encourage multiculturalism as much as I can, mostly just for those things. Now, with understanding that, I want you to understand that when we talk about these topics, even though I have this desire to do diversity and multiculturalism, we have to really understand the context from which we are working within. And the context that we're going to work within when we're talking about diversity and multiculturalism is that we're going to talk about it from the perspective of being a human resources officer. Now, all organizations, you know, have certain laws that they have to follow, and we'll definitely talk about a lot of those as we start going into this. But it's very easy to get sort of mixed as to, you know, what our roles are within this topic. When you work for a company, our job is to work for the company. Okay, we work for the company. Now, how does diversity and multiculturalism work into that as one of our roles within the company? We're to encourage diversity and multiculturalism. You know, the law requires that we have to, and there's ways that they you know, get us to do that. But more importantly, you know, and I've talked about this in some of my other videos, you have the foundation, which is your strategic management, and then on top of that you have diversity, and then you have these pillars where we're going to talk about recruiting, selection, and some of these other areas. Knowing everything that I know, that you know about me now, as I've gone ahead and said all of that, when we're dealing with a diversity issue, you have to remember that the company is the perspective we're supposed to be taking, and making sure that the policies and the procedures and the laws are completely followed. Okay. Now, one of the greatest things, and I've talked to people who actually do diversity for a living, and they say it's great rewarding work. Even though they do have sometimes some conflicts of interest, because, you have somebody who's claiming that, something was done to them, and it's your job as the HR person to do the investigation, and you might sympathize with the person. But that's not how justice gets done, okay? The way that justice gets done is that we do the investigations, we do all the policies and the procedures as we are required to with the law. And then the real way that the justice is going to get done is really making sure that those policies and procedures and everything is set up so that we can prevent a lot of these things. But then if it ever does happen, that justice can prevail. And so that's how I always kind of approach this topic. And I know that some people might have some very strong opinions about that, but I'm gonna kind of leave that as it is. In this section, we're going to talk about diversity and multiculturalism sort of at the high level, and we're going to define and explain and identify through power and privilege is what they really talk about in this book, and then also provide reasoning as to why diversity is important to maintain profitability. And again, I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of you working as an HR officer in the organization. Okay, some of the stuff that they talk about kind of goes into a lot of the stuff that I've already talked about, and some people might ask, why did I just go through that entire process where I was talking about my history? I find it to be, every time I teach this class, I always tell the exact same story. Number one, you understand where I'm coming from, but more importantly, it also allows me to sort of empty myself slightly from my personal feelings about this topic as I teach this, and I find this to be very helpful because remember, we have a lot of laws that we have to work on, we have a lot of things that we have to do, but the end goal is to encourage diversity within the organization, and we're going to talk a lot about why we end up doing that. And they talk a little bit about power and privilege, and I would love to sit here and talk about power and privilege in this, but here's the thing. I do a lot of talking about power. Power is actually a very it's a no pun intended, it's a powerful subject for me. That really was not intended to be a joke. I didn't plan that in advance. But the reason why power is, I think, is very important because I find how it influences so many of the things that we do. And when you start talking about power, there's I think power in negotiation has a role in negotiations. I think power also has a very strong role in various other aspects of organizational settings, particularly where it comes to leadership, and then also, power also really takes place in one thing we talk about when we get into culture. I know this isn't really supposed to be a culture class. I'm going to kind of hit on it a little bit, and then I'm going to do a flyby, so to speak. But when we talk about, power and culture, there's a philosophy in culture that that organizational culture can be integrated, differentiated, or fractured. And so if it's if it's integrated, we basically have one culture exists. If we have differentiated culture, it's more like subgroups of culture within an overall culture that exists within the organization. And then you have the fractured, which basically says the culture really doesn't exist. I'm really oversimplifying that. I mean, that's not the entire skinny of it, but if I were to go into it, it's like another 20 minutes in order to be able to go into it. Power influences how a lot, and I tend to believe that in the organizations that I tend to work in, differentiated is probably the more predominant that I've seen personally. Now that's just anecdotal evidence that I have. But power, when I start looking at it, is you have these little subgroups of culture that are kind of fighting over in each other, and you could see this when an organizational change has to take place. Who has the power to make something happen? Who has the power not to make something happen? And you might kind of say, well, Kevin, does that really relate to the kind of power that we're talking about here? And I would argue that it does, because if we start looking at power from different perspectives, and start bringing it into the idea of, how power can influence when you have these different sort of subgroups that are taking place, it can be very helpful to understand, how organizational change can take place. But more importantly, I think you could also understand how certain resistors to organizational change take place. Now, when we talk about those groups can be made up of just about anybody. I mean, when I work in accounting firms, it seems like staff accountants are different from managerial accountants to partners, and then you take some of these other groups, administrative staff, and so on and so forth, and there's within these groups these little subcultures that kind of take place. And if you're under the misconception that that people who work in the admin staff are not as powerful as the ones who work in the partner staff, I would say that you would be very sorely mistaken very quickly. I mean, yes, technically the partners in an accounting firm have the power to fire, but there's, I've seen where an administrative staff has shot their mouths off to a partner, walked out of the room, and nobody touched them. That's power. Because people realized how important that admin staff was. And also that, doing something to that admin staff would probably, hurt the other people who support her. And I find it, and I know it sounds like I'm kind of rambling a bit, but I find it interesting in how it interwaves into diversity. Sometimes the groups can be defined based off of, some of these diversity elements that we run into. When we think of diversity, I'm sure the first thing that comes to most people's minds is race. That's just, because of, and I think it's more because of the topics of the day. But also, it's just sort of, how we've kind of, how we've had this conversation, especially in recent history. But when we start looking at, some other areas where they have like social class, gender, and sexual orientation, I think a very good, and here's the thing, I really love that they bring up social class, because social class is where I felt that most things lied anyways. I've always felt that a lot of this had to do more with economics, but and I've been reading a lot of articles, in the past. I haven't been able to lately, but in the past I've read a lot of articles where they've talked about how social class has a significant factor in power and how people are. So when we start talking about what is diversity and multiculturalism, like I said, they think of someone's gender, skin color, or social class shouldn't matter. They think of someone's gender, skin color, or social class, and the book starts off with this topic. When people look at diversity and multiculturalism, they think it shouldn't matter. And obviously, in a perfect world, it wouldn't. But here's the thing that I have that kind of gets to me on that. It can be a source of strength, and I think a lot of people tend to ignore that, especially when we talk about diversity. I have seen where, and actually, let me put an example that everybody can kind of, understand. Remember the Titans. The movie stars Denzel Washington. There's some other people in it. I'm a big Denzel Washington fan. I loved him in Crimson Tide. I think Crimson Tide was probably the best movie he's been in. But anyways, it's kind of one of those things that, in this movie, remember the Titans, they were kind of talking about how these two high schools that had been segregated for many years all of a sudden had to integrate, and that included the football team. And so all of a sudden you start having the white players interact with the black players, and the things that Denzel's character does in order to get people to unite was very fascinating, and I would encourage you to watch the movie if you haven't in a while, or if you haven't ever. Because one of the things that they do is he works really hard to get the players to work together, integrate together into this unified culture. And then guess what ends up happening? Summer training comes to an end. Now they got to go back to the outside world where they haven't gone through that that integration that took place, that the players are, and there's still some animosity between the two groups amongst the football players, but for the most part a lot of it had disappeared. But once they get back out to the real world, as they would call it, reality kind of hit them like a ton of bricks, and they ran into all sorts of different conflicts. And I think it's a very good movie. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend it. I think it talks a lot about different things that really apply to what we're going to deal with within this course. So they talk about some of the reasons for diversity and multiculturalism. Number one, why it's the law. Well, I always like to put that as the end, because if you're not going to buy it for the other 2-3 reasons, first of all, I'm going to say if you're not going to buy it for the other 3 reasons, you probably shouldn't be in HR to begin with. If it has to be forced upon you because it's a law, then that's pretty bad. But that's something you can kind of use to convince people who may not be so eager to follow into this. It says we can offer to serve customers better by offering a broad range of services, such as being able to speak a variety of languages and understand other cultures. This reminds me of when, a very good example is McDonald's. McDonald's likes to, for example, if you ever, this is another movie I would recommend seeing at some point. It's a movie about Ray Kroc, stars Michael Keaton, and talks about how he built McDonald's into this empire. But one of the things that they did is they try to maintain consistency. So if you walked in and got a Big Mac in Denver, Colorado, it was the same Big Mac that you would get here in Washington, D.C. And so from those two perspectives, from those two, areas, you got the same experience. However, that didn't hold when McDonald's started going overseas. And I think one of the biggest examples is I decided I was going to go to a McDonald's while I was I was craving hotcakes for some reason, which I'm sure a lot of people in the audience can understand. McDonald's hotcakes, I think, are phenomenal. But I was craving them, and so I went to a McDonald's, and they were the same hotcakes I got in the United States, which was great. But there were other things that they served there too. You could get a teriyaki burger, which of course you can't get here in the United States, at least generally I don't think so. And so McDonald's has a set menu that sort of goes everywhere, but then also there's a few differences. For example, if you're in Texas, you can order what's called the Big Texan, where they take a burger and they slop mustard all over it, because Texans love mustard all over their burgers. And so one of the things that they were talking about when they were going to bring, let me back up a little bit. When I was talking to some people who knew the story of when McDonald's was going to come over, that was, they needed to have something that kind of looped them in that was kind of their own. And so the teriyaki burger was kind of seen that way. Although I talked to a lot of Japanese people, they didn't really like the teriyaki burger because they thought it was too sweet, but that's neither here nor there. Another example was the idea, and this is a rumor, I don't know if this is true or not, but supposedly in Spanish, the word nova means no go. And I don't know if that's true. Please leave a comment if that's the case, and if it's not the case, please let me know. I just got kind of curious. But supposedly when they decided they were going to bring the Chevy Nova down to Latin America, of course, if you're going to have a car that's named the no-go, it's probably not going to work out very well for you. It says we can better communicate with each other, save time and money and customers. And this is where I kind of noticed that as a person who, I've worked in organizations that have been very diverse in their culture, and I've seen some that have not been. And I've noticed that with the culture, with the diversity, the diverse culture organizations, it took a while to build the ability to communicate diversely. But once you had that diversity communication down, it became second nature, and we didn't have to worry too much about it. And so I think that if you encourage people to have that that ability to communicate with a broader range of audience, it actually helps. And they're right, it does save time and money eventually. In the initial, you're going to have some resistance, and that resistance is going to waste time and money. But if you persevere and you have a good change plan in effect, I think you're going to be very successful in order to get it done. With a multicultural perspective, we can create better ideas and solutions. That kind of gets back into if I'm going to introduce a product to, say, Africa, I probably want to meet with some people in Africa before I just show up and start selling my product. And more than just meet with them, I probably want them to be helping me develop the product in order to tailor to their needs. That just helps better, and it creates, and sometimes, and I'll kind of share something a little personal. My wife, flabbergasts me with some of the creativity that she has with how she solves things. I mean, I wish I could show you right behind this wall over here. There's a door to our laundry room, and the in the laundry room, what happened is we have, that's also where the cats go so they can go do their business. And so what happened is we couldn't have it to where the door would mostly shut but not completely shut, so that the cats wouldn't be afraid to do it. And so she put a door hinge on there, and it worked for the most part. One of those door hinges that automatically closes the door. It didn't do everything that she wanted it to. And so what she did is that she ended up tying a whole bunch of rubber bands together in order to go to the door. I never would have even thought about something like that. And it's kind of interesting, it's things like that. We call them jury rigs, where you can, the guy who can take duct tape and a hamster and, turn it into an inner working, particle accelerator or something like that. MacGyverism, I think, is another one thing we used to call for it. She's phenomenally good at that. It seems like a lot of the people that I meet that come from China seem to be very good at that, which is probably one of the reasons why in the Asian area, the Chinese have been well known for being the commerce experts, and so that's kind of interesting. But I've learned so much just in being interactive with her as her husband, and then she's taught me a lot of things about myself and how we could do some. Okay, so in this section we're going to talk about diversity plans, and the first thing that so the learning objective is to be able to apply strategies to create multicultural work environments and diversity plans, and the number 2 is to create an HR plan with the diversity considerations. Now, like I said, we're working for the company, so as workers for the company, we're the ones who are in charge of developing the diversity plan. We develop the strategic plan first. From the strategic plan, we then develop the diversity plan, and then on top of that, we put our pillars of success. And I know I've said it over and over and over again, but sometimes I've come to realize that repetition tends to work for learning. And so when we talk about the strategies for creating a multicultural work environment and diversity plan, one of the things that I've tended to realize is probably the biggest thing that slows down a lot of this is lack of communication. There's people who just gravitate towards certain groups. I think it's very interesting. It's and you just kind of see it when you get them together, and it's not necessarily groups based on race. It could also be based on gender. It could be based on sexual orientation. And to get those people to talk to one another about various things that they're doing sometimes can be a bit of a challenge. And usually it requires team building exercises that you can use to do that. And in some of the organizations that I've worked at that have been very successful at doing diversity exercises, diversity organizations, do these frequent team exercises where they've got people who are, they bring people in who are trained to do team building stuff in order to encourage communication amongst the members. And so that's a very good example of that. Something else is you got to make it part of your strategic plan. And I think I've talked about this in the previous video, but you have to be one of those people as well. Okay, not you, the HR officer, but the CEO has to constantly be selling the strategic management plan, and part of that strategic management plan needs to be part of the diversity plan, or needs to be the diversity plan. Okay, the diversity plan needs to be part of the strategic management plan, and it's something, and I've told you, in the past, one of the problems that we've had is, we build the strategic plan, we put it on the shelf, and then we never touch it. You need to have the CEO constantly going out there and selling this. And if you're constantly selling it, constantly talking about it, constantly bringing it up, constantly linking things towards the strategic plan, people are eventually going to get it. And that's kind of how diversity works too. And if diversity is part of your strategic plan, what ends up happening is over time, people end up people end up buying into it, and resistance tends to fade away. There's some people who say, bringing in, employee handbooks for guidance. I mean, that's all well and good. I always think it's what your actions are. Employee handbook, don't get me wrong, employee handbooks are very important. We need to have those in order to do good things. But an employee handbook is not going to solve your diversity crisis if you have one in your organization. What's going to solve your diversity crisis is going to be social interaction, breaking down barriers, getting people to work together, even if that's, some of that's somewhat forced. You can do that, and hopefully over time people can get along, or it could reinforce stereotypes, which is one reason why you kind of have to monitor it, and that's why I always talk about with ADDIE, assess, design, develop, implement, evaluate. So you got to evaluate to make sure that you're doing stuff like that. And the book talks about, the policy states it doesn't discriminate, their actions and traditions show otherwise, and do discriminate with those with some of the problems that they have. And this is something that, organizations over time tend to develop traditions. Sometimes those traditions have to be examined to make sure that they're not violating, potential successes within diversity. And sometimes, very good example, if we're going to have, happy hour Fridays, very good example of that. Well, if you're a married person like I am, happy hour Fridays sometimes is a little difficult because Friday nights my wife is driving home, I'm driving home, and both of us are kind of excited about the fact that we have the weekend going, and so it's kind of a family time for us. It can also be very important, especially beer Fridays. Your Muslim workers could be strongly affected by this. Not only is it that because of the alcohol involved, but also that's when many of them attend mosque, and so or attends to some other religious requirements, and so you're basically shutting out an entire group by saying, okay, we're all going to get together on Friday and hang out and have fun. It's one of those things that you kind of have to, you have to take a look at some of these traditions. And I'm not saying don't have traditions. I think one of the biggest problems that we've had recently is that we've moved away from so many of these things that we do as cultural building exercise, team building stuff, team building activities, that we don't do the team building because we're afraid to offend somebody. All that has to happen is, and probably a very good example of how you could do this, form a focus group. And like I said, identify who your differentiated subgroups are within your organization, whether you want to base it on however that happens. And you can form subgroups that basically say, hey, what do we need to do in order to do some of this stuff? And that could be very helpful to building that. And if you have anybody who's of a what we'll call a protected class, you want to make sure that they're included. because you don't want to have a situation where they're not included, then their ideas don't get recognized, and then you've blown another opportunity to increase diversity. And this is, later on in the book, and I kind of mentioned ADDIE. I was getting ahead of myself, but they talk about assess, develop, and implement a plan. But what drives me nuts here is that they do not talk about evaluation. Evaluation is so critical. You've got to do the evaluation, because what ends up happening is you do an assessment of diversity. Okay, we don't have diversity. Here's a plan to fix it. We'll implement the plan. And then they said, okay, well, we did what we could, and it just didn't happen. Why? What took place? Oh, you decided to do happy hour Fridays, and you found out that 20% of your population who on Fridays has religious services can't show up. Okay, that's probably something that's key and important. So there's definitely some different areas that we can find that can do that. But like I said, if you don't do an evaluation, you're not going to realize where your successes and where your failures were. Okay, and then it talks a little bit about recruitment and selection. Sometimes organizations don't mean to be discriminatory or exclusive, but their practices actually are. I used to, when I was working at one of my companies, actually it was the one that was really good at diversity, they had a gym down below that was shared by some of the other businesses that were there. And there were two individuals who used to work in one of the recruiting companies that was in the building. And of course they were an accounting recruiting firm, so there was no shortage of when you want to make a move, give me your card, and I'm kind of like, okay. But I talked to them about diversity because I was starting to teach this class, and this was many, many years ago. And I used to talk to them about how diversity impacted their workforce, and they said that they had, one of the things is they did job description builders. They had just this software that did job description builders, and they would enter in job description requirements. And sometimes it would kick out a phrase because they would say, hey, look, that phrase that you're about to use is going to create a diversity issue. And I thought it was interesting how technology has kind of morphed into helping us, make sure that we're not doing things. And I asked him about this. I said, wow, that seems kind of fascinating. Can you provide an example? He said, well, yeah. So for example, if I'm creating a job and I require that a person has a 4-year degree, if you take a look at the map of the United States as far as its diversity, and you take a look at 4-year degree college graduates, it is very different. And so one of the things that you have to do, you have to be very careful that we don't want to make a job required to have a 4-year degree when it doesn't really require one. For example, if I work as an accountant, that's pretty easy to say, okay, I need you to have 150 hours of college credits. Why? Because if you want to be a CPA, you got to have 150 hours in order to take the, when you pass the exam in order to get certified. So that's a pretty easy thing to solve, to agree with. Lawyers, same thing. If you want to be a lawyer, you're going to have to graduate from law school. I mean, that's because there's a statutory requirement. You want to be a lawyer, you want to be barred, you have to have a law degree. However, if I'm going to be a restaurant manager, do I need to have a bachelor's degree in order to do it? No. Maybe. Let's kind of examine it. And then, we can kind of ask ourselves, what are we asking our restaurant manager to do? If I'm just asking him to manage people, and I'm not asking him to do a whole lot of, business write-ups or report write-ups or things that require specialized knowledge, why do I need a 4-year degree for it to happen? Now, I can say it's preferred, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a requirement. Now, of course, if I say it's preferred, then chances are I'm probably not going to hire somebody unless they've got one, and that kind of gets into your selection. Are you really selecting people because they're very qualified for what they do, or are you just selecting them because you're trying to get around, the diversity issue? So, and one of the things I really like about this in the book, they talk about it's illegal to publish a job advertisement that shows preference for a particular group or type of person or discourages someone for applying. It says, for example, a Facebook post says reason college graduates wanted might be inclusive to younger groups and discourage a diverse older workforce. And we'll talk a little bit about age discrimination later on. it's keywords like that you kind of have to be cognizant of, and we'll talk a lot more about that when we get into recruiting and all that. So in selection, they kind of talk a little bit here about the 4/5 rule, which we'll talk about more in detail. Actually, no, it's right here. Sorry, forgive me about that. So they give you an example, and I actually have a really good example of this. And if any of my students in my class want to ask me for a copy of it, I'm happy to hand it to you. I have one that I kind of built. That's this says selection rate for women is 10% or 20%. Selection rate for men is 50%. And is it does it violate the 4/5 rule? And here they're giving you an example that it says there may be. And here's the thing, and I don't like the fact that they said adverse impact. They should have said disparate impact. And the reason why is because adverse impact, and I can't remember if we talk about this later on in this book or not, but adverse impact versus disparate impact. Adverse impact is basically if I put up a sign and says, this race only apply, this race may not apply. That's pretty blatantly a violation of the law. Okay, I mean it's pretty blatant. There's no it's yes or no. It's binary. You violated the law at that point. That's where we would say that there's adverse impact, where it's pretty much where the person just comes out and says it. I don't want people of a certain race working here. I don't want people of a certain gender working here, and that's what they're saying. Disparate impact, on the other hand, happens to be a term that basically is used where it's more insidious. So for example, get back to the college degree example. If I want to reduce the chances that a minority is going to work for me, I might require that all of my jobs have to have college degrees. Because traditionally, the concentration of, majorities, aka whites, Caucasians, to minorities is, the whites are more plentiful in the college degree compared to minorities, as opposed to those who do not have a college degree. And again, oftentimes with disparate impact, it's not necessarily intended. It's just, a very good example, we've been hiring, managers to work in the restaurant for 10 years. We've always required them to have a college degree, and nobody just bothered to look at it. And then they kind of look at it and they're like, yeah, why have the past, 10 managers that we've hired all been white? Well, what can we do to increase and get more minorities to apply? And they start talking to some people and they say, well, this college degree kind of prevents me from doing it. So maybe they don't do it. Does that to suggest, now one of the things I've always loved about, especially when my time in the military, we encourage everybody to get their college degree, and I think that we've helped with that to get past a lot of that stuff, especially people who have had a chance to serve in the service. However, if you're not able to get a college degree because you don't have time, you don't have money, or you don't think you have the ability, it can cause a blockage that may not necessarily be intended. That would be called disparate impact. Okay. And then we talk about here testing. If employment tests are required, a test has to be direct relation of a job. So, for example, if you want to use a personality test, must show the personality or non-discriminatory, do not exclude population. I think of a very good example requiring a math test if you're going to have somebody be an accountant. That's pretty easy, to kind of justify. And then also, if you're going to require people to, handle sensitive material, you're probably going to require a background check. I mean, that's pretty reasonable. If you're going to have people who are going to be, for example, food stalkers, well, actually, that's probably not as good of an example, but I guess it is. But if you're going to have them, be stacking boxes or things of that nature, background checks probably not as critical as it would be for, handling, say, for example, national secrets. or have potential to be exposed to national secrets, then obviously you need to make sure that, and actually the federal government requires that as part of the law. So in a lot of this stuff, it's not so much that you're forbidden from doing it, as much as if you're going to do it, which is okay, you might have to do what's called reasonable expectations of providing accommodations. Accommodations have to be reasonable. So for example, if I bought a building that was built in 1990, it's going to have certain codes that it has to live up to. For example, actually 90 is probably a bad example. 95, we'll go with 95. So if I buy a building that was built in 1995, it's probably going to be ADA requirement compliance, because I believe ADA was passed in 1991. And so, it's going to have the elevators, or it's going to have ramps, or it's going to have other things so that, disabled people can move around freely in it. If my building was built in 1901 and a survey is done and it says, okay, in order to make this building ADA compliant, we'd have to pretty much destroy the building. Then it starts to say, okay, is the cure worse than the disease, so to speak, just because of the fact that, we'd have to destroy the building, pretty much rebuild it. And after I've just spent all this bread on a new building, it's probably not, economically feasible for me to be able to do that. So that's kind of what they're talking about there. Later on, we talk about pay and promotion. Development policies to do pay and promotion, make sure that hours work, and when we talk about pay and promotion, usually where we run into it's gender discrimination, and oftentimes it's because occupational choice, hours worked, and then salary received is generally some areas where women are, seen as being discriminated against. And so whatever reason for the pay differences, all managers should be aware of these differences when hiring and promoting. And that's kind of what we really need to be focusing on, is that it's not so much that we have to change the whole world to make it, unilateral. It's more along the lines that what we have to do is be aware of what we're doing and how it could adversely impact how we want to serve our employees, but also developing policies that might remove some of that stuff. And usually, when I talk to people about making things more diverse, I always talk about low-hanging fruit first. There's a lot of stuff that we can do that's sort of low-hanging fruit. That's just really easy, and blatant. A very good example. I used to work at an organization where they did where they did sort of an inspection of the floor, and they looked for anything that was culturally insensitive or genderly insensitive. Very good example. The traditional one is the calendar. Somebody putting up an inappropriate calendar, whether it's firefighters holding kitties, or guys who have race cars with women that are scantily dressed. Probably not stuff that should be happening in a workplace, and as a result of which I call that low-hanging fruit. It's pretty easy. Hey, we're not going to allow calendars that are going to have inappropriate images. That is an example of low-hanging fruit. Very, very high-hanging fruit I would call, where we're just not having any communication between people of different ethnicities. That is something that takes a long time to plan out. But like I said, once the planning gets done and once it gets executed, you're gonna yield a lot of fruit off of that. And I've seen, like I said, that third accounting firm that I worked for, diversity was something they put in their mission statement, their vision statement, and they shot for the moon on that, and they blew it out of the water. And in fact, if I wasn't running my own company, I'd probably go back and work there. I really liked that company so much, and it was a great place to be. So they say, now what? They talk about, the awareness aspects and all that stuff, and then, what can you do? They give you some aspects to creating a training focused on multiculturalism, like I said, bringing about multicultural knowledge and customs and religions. That third accounting firm that I worked at, they do a lot of nonprofit work. They do a lot of nonprofit, accounting work, and as a result of which, they're going all over the world. So as they're going to these different areas within the world, they're coming back and they're saying, hey, we were in this country, and this, they bring back some souvenirs that kind of talk a little bit about it, and they said, we went into these restaurants, these were some customs and courtesies that we ran into, and it was, just something to just teach us about it, and that encouraged. But there's only auditors that got to do that. Us tax people, we don't get to do the fancy trips. So that can also create jealousy, though. I remember, of course, now I'm married with a son, so of course, galloping around the world is not as exciting as it used to be, but there's definitely a few times where I'm kind of like, yeah, maybe one of our clients needs some work in Hong Kong. I can go to Hong Kong and we can, get some good food and do some stuff, but it doesn't always work out that way. You teach employees to listen actively. This is actually a skill that takes a while to develop. It took me a while to learn it because I just had to constantly be thinking about how to listen actively as opposed to hearing. Train employees to rethink current policies and how they might be exclusive to certain groups. This is kind of where we would do cultural awareness, where we would talk about some of the things. You want to be careful when you do this, though. You don't want to make it sound like you're picking on somebody. I've seen this go wrong once where, we were kind of, making somebody, and the only examples that seemed to be getting brought up was on this one person. And he thought, you obviously don't like anything that I do. And so what ended up happening is he started feeling excluded, which is kind of against the point of what this whole thing is. And so you want to deal with it, fairly, but at the same time, use some examples of people in the office. And chances are what you're going to realize is some people are probably feeling the same way, and they're just too afraid to say anything about it because they think somebody's going to retaliate or somebody's going to be upset about it. Work on resistance to change. This is something that I find fascinating. I love talking about resistance to change, and finding, this is the way we've always done it. I hate that phrase so much it boils my blood every time I hear it. I don't care if that's the way you've been doing it. I just, forget diversity for 5 seconds. That's a phrase that blows my mind. How we can constantly say that and use that to me is a cop-out and it's an excuse. Now, I don't say that when I talk to people about it, but sometimes I bring it up and I go, and my favorite answer to, well, that's the way we've always done it. Oh, are you sure that's the right way to do it? That gets people kind of thinking a little bit. Now, if they're obstinate, or want to be obtuse, they're pretty much going to say, well, yeah, of course it is, because, we've never had any problems before. Well, that's when you kind of say, well, we've got a few now, or maybe you haven't been noticing them. Kind of puts the other person where they start thinking, okay, maybe. Now, if the person's just gonna, like I said, they're going to be obstinate or obtuse, they're probably, nothing you say is going to change their mind anyways. Does your leadership have a multiculturalism perspective? We always talk in the accounting world, and I love this, and I bring this into the HR world a lot. Tone at the top. We talk about tone at the top a lot. When we do auditing, but we all. Okay, so while these suggestions may not eliminate all of the issues that you are going to be dealing with, something that I kind of talk about when we deal with this issue is we want people to really use some of these tricks and not tricks, I should say, these techniques in order to help reduce a lot of the problems that you might encounter with regards to diversity and multiculturalism. But it's still going to require an active listening and active an active role on your part. So you can use training, and you can use some of the other areas in order to help them to help your employees make better decisions when interacting with different groups. And there's a list here that it says things to consider when creating a multicultural and diverse work environment. A lot of these are, I mean, they're good to use. Make sure that you use them with with care and caution, as is, sometimes it may inadvertently cause some other issues. So, and so now we're going to talk about, in this section, multiculturalism in the law. And this is where I kind of get into you work for the company, and that's your role, and that's where you kind of need to focus yourself. Because there's a couple things we're going to talk about. First of all, the EEOC, which the EEOC has certain requirements that corporations and organizations have to do in order to avoid any legal perils as a result of diversity and workplace incidences. So the first thing that they do, like we'll talk a little bit about the EEOC and then the various laws that are covered under the EEOC. And so the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they say it here, it's tasked with enforcing federal employment discrimination laws. That is, that's not to suggest that there aren't other agencies that also work to enforce discrimination laws. But this is the primary one where it tends to fall to deal with this, and it's of course part of the Department of Labor. And it says that employers with at least 15 employees or 20 for age discrimination are covered under the EEOC. So if you have 15 or more employees, that's when you really need to be focusing on making sure that your legal compliance is done right. And so what I've always said is, like, as you know, I own my own business. And I planned a while ago that if I ever got to the point where I had 15 employees or more, I'm going to hire an HR representative that deals with a lot of the things that we are going to have to deal with. If you do have this, there are certain actions and compliance issues that you have to work with. It's headquartered in DC with 53 field offices throughout the United States. They also talk about here, if you have more than 100 employees, you have to fill out a form called the EEO-1, which has to be done yearly, and it has to be done yearly by September 30th. They don't mention that in the book here, but I do know that because, and the reason for that, I think most of our students will know, especially if you work for the federal government, is September 30th is the end of the fiscal year. And so that's, I think that's part of the reason why they did it that way. So it's necessary. Okay, so there's a legal compliance, but more importantly, and they kind of go back to this, and we've said this throughout the entire thing. Law aside, that's only one reason why you should be participating in the diversity and multiculturalism environment. More importantly, though, is that it is actually in everyone's best interest to do so. Not so much to some people say that it's it's to avoid pain, but I say no. Actually, it's so that you can increase additional benefits that you may not be realizing that you're missing. So I think it's a very important thing to get out there and make sure that as HR representatives that we are constantly pushing for that within the organization. So there's some federal legislation that they deal with. And this is where they start talking about some of the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of '64. This is where they it was this act enforced by, it covers several areas which discrimination was rampant, and you have to remember in 1964 I would say America is a far different place than it is today, and so areas of discrimination that we had back then, it's definitely different than it was back then, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's gone. And so there's definitely some work that still needs to be done. But one of the reasons why I really want to focus on this area is where they talk about the BFOQs. And BFOQ, which stands for Bona Fide Occupational Qualification. The bona fide occupational qualification is essentially where you are, you have a reason to not have to not consider diversity when making either a selection or a recruitment. And the BFOQ, they use, for example, here, age limits for pilots for safety reasons and Christian college requirements that presidents be Christian. I actually prefer a much more, something that I think hits most people, probably a little easier. And that would be the fact that, actors, a very good example. So if I'm going to form, and I told you I'm a big Denzel Washington fan. I also loved one of his movies, Glory. If I was going to shoot Glory, I need to hire people who are going to have I'm going to hire actors that have, certain characteristics that are going to match those that were serving in the Buffalo Soldiers back in, back during the Civil War, and they're all black. So I'm not going to go out there and hire Asian actors. I'm not going to hire Native American actors. I'm not going to hire white actors to play those roles. So there's sort of this bona fide occupational qualification that can happen. Where I can say, look, as an actor, I'm creating this movie in order to have the specific desired effect of it. I need to not consider diversity in the same context that I would in other organizations. Another example is, if I'm going to hire, a movie to talk about Vikings, probably not going to have to go out and do a whole lot of diversity hiring in that area, since Vikings came from Sweden, and Swedish people generally are Caucasian by nature, of course. So you're not going to go out there and really focus on diversity in the same ways that you would other areas. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're shooting a movie, that other areas that don't have that BFOQ aren't going to need to have that diversity aspect considered into it. So, for example, if the company that's shooting it, and I'm just throwing it out there, I don't know who actually shot for Glory, but if it was Paramount can't go out there and say, well, we're an acting company, so we don't have to worry about diversity in our organization at all. That would just be ridiculous. And so BFOQ is always attributed to a specific job, to a specific position, not to the organization, not to a department, not to other areas. And BFOQs really focus on facts and circumstances. And so if you want to sit there and say, I don't want to hire somebody for, considering diversity, and here's the reasons why, there's not like a manual that you can go to that says these are the ones that are going to get you off. It's not mechanical, such as like the 4/5 test is. But, so, facts and circumstances, sometimes it involves the lawyers getting together and saying, yeah, this is legitimate, or no, this isn't legitimate. And sometimes this can lead to, facts and circumstances kind of issues can lead to what I would say frivolous actions, where some people come in and they say, well, yeah, I know you're making a movie about Vikings, but, you still should consider, you still didn't hire me because of, whatever reason, or in the case of Glory, you didn't hire me because, if somebody who's white wants to file a lawsuit or something of that nature. What ends up happening is, like I said, the lawyers usually get together, and oftentimes those cases don't go very far. It's if the BFOQ is legitimate. Now, if they're trying to claim BFOQ and the BFOQ is not actually needed there, then obviously you're gonna be in some trouble. So the next area that they talk about are some of the areas where discrimination protections exist, or discrimination issues can exist, and sometimes some laws will cover these areas. The 11 that they have listed there, which is age, disability, equal pay, genetic information, national origin, pregnancy, race, color, religion, retaliation, sex, and sexual harassment. When we're talking about this, I want you to think of a term that tends to get put out there, and that's called protected class. And this is a term that they put out there that basically says, look, in the law, where they said, look, we've seen discrimination that's taken place historically within certain groups. And so what ends up happening is we're going to pass legal legislation, and we're going to create what we call a protected class, where these groups have certain protections. And one of them that they don't list down here on the list is actually veterans. Veterans is another example of a protected class, because one thing they noticed was that after coming home from Vietnam, there were a lot of employers who didn't want to hire them. And I actually was noticing a lot of that lately. People who were coming home during 2009, 2010, there were some people who were starting to say some things about well, people who served in Iraq or whatever might have PTSD, and as a result of which they don't want to hire them. Veterans are a protected class if they as long as they have a campaign medal. They're a protected class. If they served in Vietnam, they're a protected class. And that's, I throw that out there also because I know a significant population of our student population is military. So first of all, they talk about age, and with the age, age is going to protect you if you're 40 or older under the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. And I remember this was kind of significant for me because when I left the military, I was 38, and I tried to get back into the accounting industry, and I had no protections unless I had waited for 2 years. It's kind of funny. They draw this hard line for age 40. I experienced age discrimination. There were a couple people who said, I'd really like to hire you, but quite frankly, Kevin, you're too old. Now they said it orally. I didn't record it, so obviously I couldn't sue them for it. But and even if I did, it wouldn't have fit under this law anyways. But under the age of 40, it seems that they have sort of free reign to do what they want. But again, if you're trying to encourage a diversity and multicultural environment, the law shouldn't be the reason why you do it. Then they talk about disabilities with the American Disabilities Act. There's a whole lot of things that end up that come into the Americans with Disabilities Act, and especially with they have a legal term in here that's really important, and that is reasonable accommodation. If you have somebody who has a disability and they are as with their disability, they can come in and work. A very good example is an accounting firm. If somebody's in a wheelchair, accounting work shouldn't have any issues. There may be some accommodations that I have to make sure that there's enough room for the employee to get in and around using their wheelchair. And in my office, it's pretty small, so that might be harder to do than others. But most buildings now are being built with that in consideration, and so if you do if you do hire somebody who has disabilities, there's a reasonable accommodation that needs to take place. A reasonable accommodation is defined by the EEOC as any change in work environment or in the way things are done customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal opportunities in employment. And like I said, within the accounting industry, that's pretty easy to do. As compared to, say, for example, construction. If you're in a wheelchair and I expect you to be able to climb up into buildings that haven't been built yet, there's just certain amounts that, there's just certain things that I just can't do. And if I were to try to do it, it would cause undue burden onto the employer. And sometimes that's an action that the employer can take that just says, hey, look, we'd love to do this, but in order to do this, we have to do these things, and it's going to create an exorbitant cost. It's going to create an exorbitant, even if it creates an unsafe work environment. So if you work in an office environment, this generally is not going to be as much of an issue, but there's definitely some things that you can do that really help, that allow people to participate in the workforce. And the disability is defined by law as a physical or mental condition that limits a major life activity such as walking, talking, seeing, hearing, or learning. History of a disability. Physical or mental impairment that is not transitory or expected to last less than 6 months. So this is where they were kind of arguing initially where pregnancy was considered an ADA type act. So I'm sorry, an ADA type condition, because obviously pregnancy, usually goes 10 months. And so initially, before they started passing a lot of laws that protected pregnancy, conditions, this is where people kind of got to it. Now, I've never worked in a company where, pregnancy was so much of an issue. Probably the Navy was probably where it was a bigger issue, because obviously if you're pregnant, they didn't want you deployed, because there were safety issues. Then they needed you to be able to maintain safety issues. But generally, if you're assigned to shore duty, there was never any issue, unless you're working around chemicals or things of that nature. And usually what would end up happening is, if they had to move you off your regular duties and put you onto, they would just assign you to similar duties on the side that would allow you to continue progress in your career while until your child was born. So that's the kind of things that go under for disability. Equal pay and compensation, we've really talked a little bit about this in the past, but this really tends to focus more towards gender, especially within, there's that statistic that they kind of throw out that 77 cents on every dollar is what a woman makes versus a man. That's a very broad, and nobody's going to hold you to the 77 cents versus a dollar legal limitation or legal requirement. But what they will do is that they'll say, look, in your industry, your average compensation is this. You're paying women that. They're going to consider the two, and again, it comes back to facts and circumstances. And this is why it gets really important as a person to write your job descriptions as completely as possible. So with the requirements that I have with the jobs that I do in the accounting industry, of course, in the accounting, in order to get your CPA, you have to have 150 credit hours, and then you have to pass a CPA exam. But you can't even sit for the exam unless you have a bachelor's degree. So it's very easy for me to sit there and say, well, you have to have a bachelor's degree. So if somebody's trying to claim to me that I'm paying somebody less than somebody else, maybe it's because they don't have the bachelor's degree, or maybe they don't have the 150 hours. And so it's very imperative that you write down not only your job requirements, but also your preferreds, because those preferreds can actually help you and look, it's not about getting out of trouble. It's more about providing guidance to doing the right thing in the first place. So if I have good, well-written job descriptions, maybe I pay this person more than I pay this other person because this person fits more of my preferred job descriptions than this person does. And that's sort of kind of the thing that you want to make sure that you do. For genetic information, this was a recent law that took place in November 2009. This, one of the things that, we talk about the 23andMe, we talk about the, we talk about the 23andMe and the, Ancestry.com genetic tests. You may find out that, somebody in your genetic history was famous and that they died of a horrible disease. Now all of a sudden your employer finds out about that and all of a sudden says, well, you're kind of about the same age they were when they died, so maybe we need to maybe we need to start limiting certain things for you. First of all, I think that's a ridiculous thing. I mean, it would be very difficult to do, but where we see it more commonly is, the employers can't discriminate on an employee who has a family history of diabetes or cancer. My father had cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. My grandfather died of prostate cancer. So there could be some discrimination that could take place because they said, well, if we expect you to have these, you're going to jack up our health costs, so we're not even going to hire you because we don't want to have our health costs go through the roof. So there's a lot of So there's a lot of areas that we kind of have to take into consideration when looking at genetic information. The next section where they talk about national origin, it is illegal to treat people favorably because they're from a particular part of the world. I think that's pretty much common sense, but where this really comes into effect is where they talk about the English only policy. And they said it's an English-only policy is allowed if it is needed to ensure, say, the safe and efficient operations of the employer's business. One of the things, and I've actually run into this at a recent company that before I left. They were talking about possibly holding up a promotion for an individual because his accent was very heavy, and they needed him to be able to communicate with the employer or with the clients. And this is where I kind of brought this up. I said, look, this is ridiculous. Why are we doing this for this reason? I mean, the guy's perfectly capable of doing his job. And it seemed like that the only issues where they had it was when he was on the phone. So I said, well, have him not do a whole lot of phone calls. I mean, there's ways that we can make workarounds with this to accommodate it. And I ran into initial resistance, but I think after some time and after showing them the law and how it was important for us to do this, I think I got a lot of people to kind of accept it. So. And luckily I followed up with that person. He's doing very well in his career, so obviously it worked out. Pregnancy, we talked a little bit about it. They created the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of '78 and was added to the Civil Rights Act of '64. And again, they've talked about you cannot, and this, and I see where something like this could really come in is recruiting. You're sitting there, you're about to hire for a job, and the person sits down to do the interview, and you find out they're 6 months pregnant. I mean, you notice they're 6 months pregnant. I mean, if a woman's 6 months pregnant, it's going to be pretty obvious. And so you sit there and say, hey, look, I don't want to hire you until the baby's born, because I'm going to train you up in order to do this job, but then I'm going to lose you for roughly about 4 to 8 weeks as you're trying to get your baby and everything taken care of. That is precarious, to say the least. And what you need to do is you need to find a way to be able to work around that when and where possible. Now, obviously, so for example, if I'm hiring somebody, say for the Christmas season, and I ask them how pregnant are you, they said I'm 8 months pregnant, and it's the middle of November. There's a good chance that the baby's going to be born during the Christmas season. So, that can really bring up some concerns. And again, once you run into these kind of questions, it's always a good idea to ask legal counsel on how to deal with that. And especially, I think where seasonal work really comes into effect, and that can be kind of a concern. And one thing I do like about how they bring this up is that the Family Medical Leave Act really only applies to them if they've worked 1,250 hours or more over the past 12 months. So if a person's coming in for seasonal work, they're not going to qualify for FMLA anyways, but it's something that you definitely need to consider. Race, color. When we talk about diversity issues, this is probably the number one thing that comes up in people's minds. I know it does for me. And it's just because it seems to be in the news all the time, but also dealing with it on a daily basis. The paragraph here is short, but obviously the decisions and the discussions in this are not. So make sure that you're putting policies in that can prevent a lot of this from happening. Religion. Of course, each one of us has a First Amendment right to the religion. I've heard some people try to argue, well, that only applies, with the Congress passing laws against the religion. That's nice, but the Civil Rights Act of '64 now tells you that this is illegal. So, again, you shouldn't be doing this just because of a law, but it should be because I as an American veteran, I hold the first 10 amendments not speaking right. I hold the Bill of Rights very importantly in my life, and I don't apply them just in terms of you know, my, I don't apply it in terms of my, my government, but also in my life. So, you know, this is just something personally that I deal with, and how I deal with it. But the law covers accommodations for dress and grooming, such as headscarves, religious dress, uncut hair, beard in case of a Sikh. You know, and here's the thing. I've worked with a lot of people from the Sikh community. I think they're phenomenal workers. They you know, everyone I've ever met has usually been very kind. I can't imagine why somebody would put a policy up that discriminates against them and say, well, we don't want you here because, you know, you can't conform to our dress situation. I think it's time that, I think it's, it's a good case for a lot of people to take some consideration to doing some of those opening up in that area. And I'm passionate about the Sikh community, just particularly because I think it's one that is really, I mean, there's a pretty large Sikh community contingent here in the Washington D.C. metro area, and I have a lot of interactions with them. So I tend to get a little, it's a little personal for me, just because of how I interact with that community. Then we talk about sex and sexual harassment. I mean, no more a timely subject than today, with everything that's kind of been going on with Capitol Hill recently. As with all EEOC laws, this relates to hiring, firing, job assignments, layoffs, trainings, and fringe benefits. Sexual discrimination, of course, is wrong, and we need to build policies to make sure that we deal with it. But the most important thing is to, and I like how they bring this up about the sexual harassment laws. We talk about, how sometimes a man harasses a woman, but there's, all forms of sexual harassment take place: men to men, men to women, women to men, women to women, and I've seen pretty much all of it. And what bothers me is when it's usually, especially when it's female to male or male to male, it just doesn't receive a whole lot of attention. And when I say attention, I don't mean in the media. I mean more in the workplace. There's just some times where people kind of go, for example, and I see it, and it's a stereotype. So, and it's not something we need to tolerate at all. So, as an HR person, if somebody comes to you and alleges sexual harassment, take it with the same veracity, regardless of who is the target and who is the sexual harasser, alleged sexual harasser. Retaliation. This is where we start talking about some of the if somebody files an EEOC complaint, look, and I know there's a lot of stuff that they kind of talk about in this area, but I'm going to tell you the bottom line here. Somebody files an EEOC complaint, the first thing you do is you get your lawyer. You sit down with your lawyer and listen to what your lawyer says about this. You don't want to do something, whether it's intended or unintended, that comes back to haunt you as retaliation. Get your lawyer involved, and sometimes what will end up happening is if somebody files an EEOC complaint, it's going through the process. The lawyer for the person who's filed the complaint and then the lawyer for the company need to sit down and say, okay, what are we going to do as far as work goes so that we can prevent any retaliation? And that's sort of a negotiated event, because sometimes what ends up happening, sometimes, and I've seen this where somebody's not performing very well, so they start reducing the workload, and then the person says, well, I'm being discriminated against, so they file an EEOC complaint, and the work is still not being done appropriately, and as a result of which they throttle back even more, and then it's seen as retaliation. Not that that's like I said, if you get people together in the room and you kind of say, okay, look, this is what we're going to do going forward, and you just kind of plan it out, I think it tends to help everybody in the long run. And I think it also, the other lawyer is also, usually wants that to happen too, because the last thing they want is their client to be, the last thing they want is their client to face problems as a result of this, because it can have financial impact. Military service, we talked about the veteran status, but this is really referred to, or we talk about USER, Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. It really focuses on reserves, guards, and other uniform services, but mostly the reserves and the guards. And the reason is that if you join the National Guard, I remember back in the 80s, if you join the National Guard, I mean, the most problematic call-up that you might have is in the middle of summer in South Dakota, the National Guard gets called all the time to go fight fires, just because they don't have enough people to do it when a big fire is happening. And so that was kind of the big thing. Once we started getting to around 2001 and after 9/11, the reserves and guards got called up a lot more. And so you started seeing where some employers were kind of like, look, if you can go do your thing, but when you come back, you may not have a job, and that obviously creates problems. The men and women who serve in our armed forces, God bless them. They need those protections in order to be able to do the service that's necessary. And I think that this is a good act. I think they're all good acts, but I really like this one because there were I knew 3 of my friends who were National Guard who did not have jobs when they came back, and they said, well, we found somebody else to replace them, and it wasn't, it's not a good situation to be in. Usually what they'll do is they have to bring you back into the same job that you did before or a substantially equivalent job. And so sometimes they've had to hire somebody while you were gone. That person's performing well. They don't want to fire them just because you came back. But there's no job available for you in that area. They can reassign you to something else that's substantially equivalent in terms of pay, responsibilities, and again, that's always facts and circumstances. So if your employer tries to get you to do something that you're not comfortable with because you're coming back from your National Guard duty or your reserve duty, my recommendation would be to seek legal counsel and then deal with that. But if you're the company that's dealing with this, again, seek legal counsel. Make sure that your facts and circumstances are set onto your side. Okay, folks. Well, that's all I've got for this chapter. This video has taken quite a bit to get done, just because of the fact we've had some technical issues. Again, if you are in my class and you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Just go ahead and send me an email. You know how to get in touch with me. And if you're not in my class, go ahead and leave comments in the comment box below, and we'll be very happy. I'll be happy to respond to any questions and concerns. And it pops into my my email account that somebody does it. So even if it's 4 years later, I had a video I put out about 4 years ago that I got a comment on recently, which I thought was kind of interesting. But if you, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and thank you very much.